This online lecture covers chapters 12 through 14. This is part 5 of our nervous system lecture series covering the spinal cord, reflexes, and the autonomic nervous system. So in the first part of this lecture, we're going to finish off chapter 12 talking about the central nervous system. So we've already covered the brain extensively. So that's the first organ of our central nervous system. So now we're going to focus in on the spinal cord, which is the second organ of our central nervous system. The spinal cord is going to exist within our vertebral column. So the spinal cord is enclosed in the vertebral column. It's going to extend all the way from the base of the skull. The structure at the base of the skull is called the foramen magnum, all the way down to the first or second lumbar vertebra. So the spinal cord is enclosed in the vertebral column. The vertebral column is going to connect to the base of the skull at the foramen magnum. It's going to extend all the way down, and the spinal cord is going to end at around the first or second lumbar vertebra. The spinal cord is going to contain two-way conduction pathways to and from the brain. In other words, the spinal cord is going to include sensory tracts containing sensory information and bringing that sensory input to the brain. It's also going to contain motor tracts, and those motor tracts are going to be carrying motor output from the central nervous system or from the brain all the way down to those effector organs. So the spinal cord contains two-way conduction tracts or pathways to or from the brain. They're going to contain neurons that are bringing information to the brain in sensory tracts, and they're going to be we're also going to have tracts called motor tracts that are carrying motor output from the brain to effector organs. Additionally, the spinal cord is going to be the site of our reflex centers. So spinal reflexes are going to occur in the spinal cord. The spinal cord connects to the peripheral nervous system via spinal nerves. So the spinal cord connects to the peripheral nervous system via spinal nerves. So as you look down the spinal cord here, you're going to see 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are going to leave the vertebral column via the intervertebral foramen. So the intervertebral foramen are just holes in the vertebral column, allowing for those spinal nerves to exit the vertebral column and innervate the periphery of our bodies. So I mentioned that the spinal cord is going to end at about the first or second lumbar vertebra. So we can see that about right here. And so you'll notice that the spinal cord ends in kind of this cone-shaped structure called the conus medullaris. So the spinal cord ends at about the first or second lumbar vertebra, and it ends in a structure called the conus medullaris. However, you'll notice that we have spinal nerves that are still extending down, kind of chasing their exit from the vertebral column. So spinal nerves are going to extend down actually past the spinal cord, and they're going to exit the vertebral column at their respective intervertebral foramen. The structure of the spinal nerves that exist past the spinal cord is known as the cauda equina. It's called the cauda equina because it somewhat resembles a horse's tail. The cauda equina reflects the fact that the vertebral column actually develops faster than the spinal cord during development. So during development, the spinal cord is almost chasing the vertebral column, and once the spinal cord stops developing, when the vertebral column stops developing, those spinal nerves have to chase their exit from the vertebral column, so they extend past where the spinal cord actually ends. Because the spinal cord does not exist past that first or second lumbar vertebra, this is a great spot to sample cerebrospinal fluid because there's not going to be a risk of hitting that important central nervous system structure. So past L1 or L2, so the first or second lumbar vertebra, we are not going to have the spinal cord present there. We'll still have spinal nerves, but we will have no spinal cord. So this is a great location for a lumbar puncture. So a lumbar puncture is when you stick a needle into the subarachnoid space in order to sample cerebrospinal fluid. So maybe you're looking for infection in the brain or the central nervous system. You might sample that cerebrospinal fluid to assess that CSF for signs of infection. So you can stick a needle into the subarachnoid space where that cerebrospinal fluid is located. Again, this is a great spot because the spinal cord does not exist past L1 or L2, so you don't risk hitting that important central nervous system structure. This diagram also does a nice job of showing that the spinal cord is protected by the same three meninges as the brain. So we've got an external dura mater. The dura mater surrounding the spinal cord is only a single layer. So it only is going to contain that inner meningeal layer. So the spinal dura mater is going to be continuous with the meningeal layer of the dura mater of the brain. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is going to have some space underneath it. So the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is known as that subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space is going to be the site of that cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to be important for acting as a watery cushion to the spinal cord, so for protection, but also for nourishment of the spinal cord cells. So our spinal cord is still going to be protected by three meninges as well as cerebrospinal fluid. It's also going to have another layer of protection, and that's going to be this fat accumulation in what's called the epidural space. So you can see here that we've got our dura mater, but then external to that dura mater, we have this kind of fatty region. This fatty region is helping to protect the spinal cord from the vertebral column. So it provides some cushioning in between that bony structure and the important spinal cord. So again, that fat or that adipose tissue is going to accumulate in what's called the epidural space. So it just provides another layer of cushioning in order to protect the spinal cord. So you'll notice that the spinal cord shown here in this cross section is going to have gray matter at the center and then white matter on the outside. So our spinal cord has central gray matter and then outer white matter. We're going to come back to the organization of that gray and white matter in a couple of slides. Flanking either side of the spinal cord is going to be the spinal nerves. So we have a right and a left spinal nerve exiting the spinal cord. These are serving the right and the left sides of the body. So spinal nerves are going to leave either side of the spinal cord. You'll notice that as the spinal nerve comes in towards the spinal cord, it's going to branch into what's called a dorsal root and a ventral root. So as the spinal nerve comes towards the spinal cord, it's going to branch into a dorsal root and a ventral root. That dorsal root, you'll notice, also has this kind of expanded region here, and that's going to be known as the dorsal root ganglion. This expanded region, or this dorsal root ganglion, is going to be the site of our sensory neuron cell bodies. So we're going to have an accumulation of sensory neuron cell bodies here. So the dorsal root is going to bring sensory information from the periphery of the body towards the central nervous system or towards the spinal cord. So the dorsal root of the spinal nerve is going to carry sensory information towards the spinal cord. The ventral root of the spinal nerve is going to carry motor output from the spinal cord to the periphery of the body, so to those effector organs. So really briefly, we can look at the flow of information through the spinal cord. So sensory information is going to come from our spinal nerves or through our spinal nerves. It's going to come through that dorsal nerve root and enter the spinal cord. Motor output is then going to leave the spinal cord via the ventral root of the spinal nerve and head towards effector organs. So the dorsal root contains sensory information or sensory or afferent pathways. The ventral root contains motor or efferent pathways. So now I want to focus in on the gray matter that exists in our spinal cord. So when we take a look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we're going to notice a couple of different regions. We're going to notice that the gray matter is kind of shaped like a butterfly, and on either side, we are going to have a series of horns. We're going to have what's called a dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn. So within the gray matter of the spinal cord, we're going to have a dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn. The dorsal horn of gray matter is going to predominantly contain interneurons. These interneurons are going to synapse with those sensory or afferent neurons that are coming into the spinal cord via that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So the dorsal horn is going to contain interneurons that are communicating with our sensory or our afferent neurons in the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So sensory information is brought to the spinal cord through the spinal nerve, specifically through that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And those sensory or those afferent neurons are going to synapse with interneurons in the dorsal horn of gray matter. Those interneurons exist completely within the central nervous system. They can then carry that sensory information up towards the brain. In the lateral horn and the ventral horn, we're going to have motor neuron cell bodies. So in the lateral horn and the ventral horn, we're going to have motor neuron cell bodies. In the lateral horn, we're going to contain motor neuron cell bodies from the autonomic nervous system. Remember that the autonomic nervous system is a branch of that motor division concerned with involuntary movements or involuntary control. So we're going to have motor neurons that are primarily concerned with involuntary movements of our organs. We're also then going to have somatic motor neurons in our ventral horn here. Those somatic motor neurons are going to be bringing motor output to our skeletal muscle. So remember that in that motor division of our peripheral nervous system, there's two branches. There's the somatic motor division and the autonomic motor division. The somatic nervous system is carrying motor output to skeletal muscle. This functions for voluntary control of movements. The autonomic nervous system is primarily concerned with movements of our viscera or of our organs. These are involuntary movements. So the autonomic nervous system is going to carry motor output to our organs in order to regulate the movements of our organs, those involuntary movements of our organs. So motor neurons exist in both the lateral and the ventral horns. and the motor neurons are going to differ in which part of the motor division they're a part of. So the lateral horn is going to contain autonomic nervous system motor neuron cell bodies, and in the ventral horns, we're going to have somatic motor nerve cell bodies. In addition to the gray matter, we have surrounding white matter. The white matter surrounding the gray matter can be divided into columns. We've got a dorsal column, ventral column, and then lateral column. We're going to come back to the white columns or the white matter in the spinal cord, but for right now, know that the white matter of the spinal cord is going to be where we have a number of tracts or groups of neuron axons. So the gray matter in our spinal cord is going to consist of the dorsal horns, lateral horns, and ventral horns. Like I mentioned, that dorsal horn is going to contain primarily interneurons. Interneurons is a functional classification of a neuron. So interneurons are exclusively within that central nervous system. So in the dorsal horn of gray matter, we have interneurons. Interneurons are primarily multipolar neurons. So interneurons are primarily multipolar, which is their structural classification. So a multipolar neuron is going to have many cellular processes, so it's going to have a bunch of dendrites and an axon. In the lateral and the ventral horns of gray matter, we're going to have motor neurons. Motor neurons are primarily multipolar neurons. That's their structural classification. So again, they're going to have many dendrites and an axon. So the lateral and the ventral horns of gray matter are going to contain multipolar neurons. So that's the structural classification of those neurons. And they're going to be motor neurons, or efferent neurons, carrying information away from the central nervous system. So you'll notice that I did not mention the gray matter containing sensory neurons. The sensory neurons are predominantly located in that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So the sensory or the afferent neurons are sending information towards the spinal cord from the periphery of the body. So the functional classification is going to be afferent or sensory neurons, bringing information to the central nervous system. The structural classification of these neurons is unipolar. So most sensory or afferent neurons are unipolar, which means they're going to have this cell body at the center and then one single cellular extension, which is this weird shaped axon. So if you remember, if I flip back a couple of slides, or on this slide actually you can see it, we've got that dorsal root ganglion here. And so remember I said that the dorsal root of the spinal nerve is going to contain those sensory or those afferent neurons. So the dorsal root ganglion is where all of those sensory or afferent neuron cell bodies exist. So expanded region of that dorsal root of the spinal nerve, so the dorsal root ganglion, it's going to contain neuron cell bodies of the sensory division. So we're going to have these unipolar neurons that have a central cell body and one axon. One thing you'll notice as you look at the gray matter as we move from the cervical region of the spinal cord to the sacral region of the spinal cord is that the amount of gray matter, specifically ventral gray matter, present at a given level of the spinal cord is going to reflect the amount of skeletal muscle innervated at that level. So in other words, the ventral horns tend to be the largest in areas of the spinal cord where you have a limb innervate, where you have limbs being innervated. So the ventral horns tend to be the largest, for example, in the lumbar region of the spinal cord, because it's innervating your lower limbs. Additionally, we notice that the ventral horns are relatively large in our cervical region of the spinal cord, Again, that's because we're going to be innervating our upper limbs, so our arms. So this diagram does a nice job of showing the flow of information from the spinal nerve through the spinal cord. So we're going to start up here in this sensory division, or our dorsal root of our spinal nerve. So if you have sensory information being received by the receptive endings of a unipolar sensory or afferent neuron, that sensory or that afferent neuron is going to send information along its long axon all the way through the spinal nerve, up through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and that sensory or that afferent neuron is going to synapse with interneurons in the dorsal root of gray matter. So sensory information is going to be received by the receptive endings of these sensory or afferent unipolar neurons. That sensory information is going to be sent from the periphery of the body to the spinal cord through the spinal nerve. As the spinal nerve approaches the spinal cord, it's going to branch into a dorsal root and a ventral root. Sensory information is going to come through that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. That sensory neuron, or the sensory neurons in the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, are going to synapse with interneurons in the dorsal root, or the dorsal horn of gray matter. So in the dorsal horn of gray matter in the spinal cord, we have interneurons. These interneurons are going to receive that sensory information from those sensory or unipolar neurons, and they're then going to relay that information up towards the brain. The brain's going to make a decision based on what to do with that sensory information, and it's then going to send motor output back down. Motor output is going to extend down through the spinal cord. We're going to have motor neurons existing in our lateral and our ventral horns of gray matter. So the neuron cell bodies are going to be located in the lateral and the ventral horns of gray matter of the spinal cord. And then the axons of those motor neurons are going to extend out through the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Remember that the ventral root of the spinal nerve is going to eventually merge with the dorsal root. We're going to have that single spinal nerve extending out from one side of the spinal cord. So our motor neuron axons are going to extend out from the gray matter of the spinal cord through the ventral root of the spinal nerve, and they're going to extend all the way out to innervate their effector organs. So think of it as sensory information comes into the spinal cord through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, synapsing with the dorsal horn of gray matter. Motor output is going to be relayed from the brain down through the spinal cord to the spinal nerve through the lateral and the ventral horns of gray matter of the spinal cord, through the ventral root of our spinal nerve, and then to our effector organs. The spinal nerve, once the dorsal and ventral roots come together, it's going to contain both sensory and motor neurons. So you'll notice here, after the dorsal and the ventral roots come together, we're going to have both sensory and motor neurons existing in the spinal nerves. So in addition to talking about the different horns within our gray matter, we can also talk about different zones. So you can see here that we actually have 4 different zones within our gray matter. So the dorsal horn of gray matter is going to contain interneurons. Those interneurons are going to be receiving sensory information either from our somatic nervous system or from skeletal muscle. So SS is going to be somatic sensory neurons. So this is going to be receiving sensory information from our muscles, for example. Additionally, we're going to have another region of interneurons that are going to be receiving sensory information from our viscera or from our organs. So we're going to have visceral sensory neurons bringing sensory information from our organs to the spinal cord to synapse with interneurons. So we have somatic sensory neurons bringing information to synapse with somatic interneurons. And then we're also going to have visceral sensory neurons coming in to synapse with interneurons concerned with visceral sensations or visceral stimuli, so our organs. In the lateral horns of gray matter and the ventral horns of gray matter, we have motor neurons. The lateral horns are going to contain motor neurons, a part of the autonomic nervous system. So they're going to be concerned with involuntary motor output of our organs. So movements of our organs. In the ventral horns of gray matter, we're going to have motor neurons that are concerned with voluntary motor output, or in other words, motor output directed towards our skeletal muscle. So we're going to have 4 different regions of our gray matter. We're going to have interneurons concerned with somatic sensory information and interneurons concerned with visceral sensory information in our dorsal horns of gray matter. In our lateral horns of gray matter, we're going to have motor neurons that are sending motor output to our autonomic nervous system, or our viscera, or our organs. And then in our ventral horns of gray matter, we're going to have motor neurons of our somatic motor division concerned with motor output to our skeletal muscle. So we have 4 different regions within that gray matter.